Renaissance was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a black cultural attraction and lasted from the 1910s to the mid 1930s. It was a golden age for many African American artists, writers, and musicians. The artists were able to have pride in and control over how the black experience was represented in American culture. The Renaissance, the Renaissance set the stage for the civil rights movement.
Hello, Mr. Hughes. It is nice to have you today.
Nice of you to have me. How are you?
I'm doing good. Do you want to jump into this interview?
Sure, why not?
All right. First question: what is the biggest hardship of your childhood?
One of them was most definitely when my parents were getting divorced and my father moved to Mexico. I was raised by my grandmother until I was 13 when I moved to Illinois.
That sucks. My prayers for you. Anyways, next question. Tell me about the pieces you have written.
I have written novels, short stories, and plays, as well as poetry, and I've also been known for my engagement in the world of jazz and the influence it had on my writing.
That is amazing. I've never heard of an artist that has written all of those during his career.
I've been told that many times. Thank you.
I bet I bet you have. But this is all we have time for. I want to give a big thank you to Langston Hughes for making time to be here.
Anytime. I love being here and talking with you.
All right. Till next time, this is your local reporter. Thank you for tuning in.
Hello, Miss Hurston. I'm happy you were able to make it today.
Thank you for having me.
What got you into the Harlem Renaissance?
Well, I moved to the Harlem neighborhood in the 1920s.
Okay, that's nice. What did you do?
I was an anthropologist and folklorist who recorded cultural history.
What was your impact on the Harlem Renaissance during the 1920s?
I was an author of novels like The Eyes Were Watching God and Sweat. She even wrote I even wrote a magazine called Fire. In my works, I wrote about accurate accounts of African American experience.
Wow, that's really cool. Thanks for allowing me to interview today.
You're welcome.
Bye.
After the First World War, the art expressed rebellion and movement. The innovations occurring at this time in painting, design, architecture, fashion, crafts, and music are still recognizable and influential. Much of modern art and contemporary art, we should give most of the credit to the artists during the 1920s.
The Lost Generation was referred to as the generation of people who reached adulthood during or immediately following World War I. Having witnessed what they considered pointless death on such a massive scale during the war, many people rejected more traditional ideas of proper behavior, morality, and gender roles. They were considered to be lost due to their tendency to act aimlessly, even recklessly, and often focusing on the accumulation of personal wealth. Many of the literature and artworks from the time period focused on the struggles that occurred during the 1920s.
The Great Gatsby was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald in 1925. From its wild parties, dancing, and illegal drinking to its post-war prosperity and its new freedoms for women, Fitzgerald wrote about the events or things that happened during the 1920s in that book.
Spectator sports in the early 1920s were wild. Football in the 1920s started with the NFL, It was a 10-year period that could be remembered more accurately as the tempestuous 20s. A major problem with the early day NFL was that its member teams were primarily situated in small cities, which was unable to generate enough fan support for the teams to financially be successful. Baseball was also a big thing in the 1920s. Baseball was known as the national pastime in the 1920s, and some major names were George Herman Babe Ruth, and he was the right fielder for the New York Yankees. He was the most famous athlete in the baseball. Swimming in the 1920s was also pretty wild, considering that they were swimming in a one-piece woolen suit, which was pretty terrible because it'd be a bunch of drag, and they wouldn't have any goggles or swim caps until later in the 1920s. Also, some famous sports stars in all of sports, just to name a few, would be Babe Ruth, and the swimmer, his name was Norman Ross, and he was an Olympian, and he would swim real fast. He was known as the fastest swimmer in the world at the time.